And now you go to church and you worship and you come out and, well, who's that mob on my front porch? And what are they doing? And how am I supposed to respond to this? So what we've wanted to do is sort of create a alternative economy, create a culture, create a community where we live with one another and interact with one another all the time. And we do it like Puritans, not like monks.
The edgy among us have a term that we call trash world, which is shorthand for the rotten fruit born by leftism and secularism, which have been undermining American civilization for decades. But that hard reality faces men with a challenge. Are we going to spend all our time decrying the actions of our enemies, or do we get started building something better? If the latter, what purpose or telos could possibly stand, not just as the most righteous one to build on, but the one that most aggravates our enemies? Only one, for the glory of God the Father. Now, what if a man, hypothetically speaking of course, were motivated by that telos? What if he had a serrated wit and a rather gentlemanly sense of irony and humor? What if he had the gift of a work ethic, passed down by a father who taught him that masculinity is the glad assumption of sacrificial responsibility? Now, what if we got that man started 40 years ago, taking one builder's step at a time, carving civilization out of his own wilderness in a college town in Idaho, a bit like John Bunyan? And then, what if we gave him a flamethrower? Which brings me to my guest this week. His name is Pastor Douglas Wilson, and he's just such a man who charted a course for Christ, for family, and for civilization decades ago. And now it's bearing fruit in a major way. He's written countless books, some of which you've probably read. He started schools you might have attended or even be applying to. You may have sat in his pews, listened to his sermons, and even enjoyed the work of his children and even grandchildren. It's a pretty remarkable Christian story in an age where there aren't many of those to look at. But again, like all good stories, it didn't happen overnight. And if his pirate flag emblazoned flamethrower, taking down Elsa, Netflix, and Instagram is any indication, God willing, it won't be stopping anytime soon. In fact, Pastor Wilson might just be getting started. In our conversation, we discussed his 40 years of preparation for war, the influence of George Gilder, his slow journey to Calvinism and postmillennialism, artificial versus natural men's initiations, the need for Christian unity, Jews as a high-performance people, and the things you'll probably never hear in a Mother's Day sermon. If you enjoy the Renaissance of Men podcast, thank you. Please like this video, share it, and subscribe. Plus, leave a comment down below letting us know the things that you think would get a church canceled on Mother's Day. Just kidding. Please don't do that. And please welcome this week's guest on the podcast, the pastor at Christ Kirk in Moscow, Idaho, the proprietor at Blog and Mablog, and the chief Firestarter of No Quarter November, for his third appearance on the Renaissance of Men, Pastor Douglas Wilson. Pastor Wilson, thanks so much for joining me again on the podcast.
Great to be with you. Thank you for the invite.
So we cross paths in an auspicious month of No Quarter November, and it'll be weapons free with the flamethrower, weapons free.
Yeah.
And I want you to know that I've done the reading. So I've read Mere Christendom, Mere Christendom, Christian Nationalism, and George Gilder's book. So
okay, all right.
Looking forward to this discussion as well. So I think where I'd like to start to maybe introduce the discussion is something that I heard you say on, I think it was on the American Moment podcast or the New Founding podcast. It was one of those two, that you've been preparing for this fight for 40 years. And I wonder if you can elaborate a bit on that. What fights, I mean, I think we can probably articulate what fight you've been preparing for, but how do you conceive of the fight, and how has that conception changed over the past 4 decades?
Okay, so that's a great question. There's a place in That Hideous Strength where Dr. Dimble is talking about how in any society or culture or company or whatever, everything is coming to a finer point. The good gets better and the evil gets worse. Everything becomes more defined. And the thinkers that I appreciated a great deal back in the day were thinkers who were able to call the shot decades, and in some case in the next century. Well, what's going to happen? Because they saw the internal logic of these ideas. You can't deny the existence of God and not have that catch up with you. It's it's going to be reflected in your laws at some point. So back in the Eisenhower years, let's say, you could have people say, well, we're a secular country. We take no stand on whether God exists or not. And when you, right after your statement, you look around and the sky's still blue and the grass is still green and the traffic, people are still driving on the right side of the road. Everything seems normal, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so everybody says, oh, I guess secularism is right then. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you say. Well, all of that is the prodigal son doesn't run out of money the first weekend away from home.
Mm.
He has been capitalized in his rebellion by his father's money. And what I mean by saying that we've been preparing for this for 40 years is that we knew that you can't spend like we're spending. You can't affirm the things we're affirming and at some point not run out of money. At a certain point, you're going to run out of all the moral capital that 1,500 years of Christendom bequeaths to you. You're going to run out of that money. And when you run out of that money, you're going to have drag queens reading to kids in the library, and all the normal people won't have an argument. Right? Mm-hmm. They don't know what to say because they ran out of money. So you've always had the troubled people, you've always had the mentally ill people, and we've always had the pervs. That's not the new part. The new part is that all the respectable, decent rulers have nothing. They can't answer. They can't answer
bankrupt.
The maniacs. They're bankrupt, right?
Mm-hmm. So you used a phrase in Mere Christendom, the trajectory of ideas, and this is kind of what you're talking about. You saw the trajectory of ideas quite
Correct.
a while ago. Okay,
right.
Is this the role that George Gilder played? Did he? It seems like he played a pretty fundamental role, especially having read the book. That this was a significant number of observations that he made in sexual suicide and after.
Yes, George Gilder was a big influence on me on calling the shot decades before it happened. In the area of sexual roles, feminism, that aspect of life. So Gilder has been a big influence on economics and tech and other areas. But the big impact he had on me was when it came to understanding that men are dominant. They're going to be dominant. And the only choice you have is whether that dominance is going to be constructive or destructive. And feminism, what feminism has done, in effect, is outlawed masculine constructive engagement. Right? So we're going to make positive, distinctively masculine contributions that are positive. We're going to outlaw those. And then everybody's astonished at the wreckage that is caused by the destructive dominance of males who can only be restrained by men.
Right. Where are they going to get all the capable males to restrain all the capable males is the question that I ask today.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right.
So maybe because I'm just reading this book now, and I know it was written in the 70s and the 80s and re-released in 1986. And so now here we are 27 years later, and he's basically articulating what has been the arc of my life as a man in many ways, learning these things by living through them and now just reading about them. When you read them originally, whenever that was, late 70s, early 80s, can you take us back to that moment and the impact in that immediate moment that had on you, the way that the light kind of went off or went on, I suppose?
Yeah, it was. So I grew up in a Christian home and had a godly father and a godly mother, wonderful, just a wonderful home to grow up in. And I grew up in positive world, Aaron Wren's positive world.
Right.
So Christianity was respected, honored, and then I had the real deal at home. So consequently, I was not in a position where I had to rethink, oh my, that's what a dad is supposed to do. I already knew that in my bones from my dad. But what Gilder, I think, and I'm just reconstructing this long after the fact, what Gilder enabled me to do was to see how that positive world outside was not going to remain positive. It had to go the positive world, neutral world, negative world. It had to go that way because he who says A must say B.
Yeah.
You can't affirm this premise and this premise and this premise and then somehow avoid the conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to wind up in a mess. And so what we've wanted to do is sort of build out and live in a little bastion of normalcy.
Mm-hmm.
We call it
Positive
Sherwood
world.
Forest, positive world, our own little positive world. We call it
Mm-hmm.
Sherwood Forest or the land of Goshen, and
Mm-hmm.
and live as though we don't believe what Kant said. Live as though we don't live as though we don't believe what Nietzsche did. So we're gonna live like Christians, engage with one another like Christians. At the same time, we can understand why things outside our community are disintegrating because they have to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. For my listeners who aren't as philosophically adept, referring to Kant and Nietzsche, maybe you can be specific
Okay.
about those for those who may not be aware of what we're talking about.
Okay. Kant tried to propose sort of a patch job. David Hume, a Scottish philosopher, basically introduced radical skepticism into the world of philosophy. We
Mm-hmm.
can't know for certain that you caused the 8 ball to go in the corner pocket because you just saw one follow the other, but you don't
Mm-hmm.
know that one caused the other. So he was a radical skeptic. Kant attempted to solve the problem by sort of postulating a noumenal realm and a phenomenal realm. And the noumenal realm we have no access to, but it's up there. And we just sort of arbitrarily live by the categorical imperative, which is his variation of the golden rule. But there's no reason why. It's just arbitrary. And then Nietzsche comes along and takes a wrecking ball to the whole apparatus. God is dead and we killed him. And Nietzsche is the father of sort of the black pilled, where there is no God, and embrace the consequences of that. The strong eat the weak.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So then the Sherwood Forest you built, sort of inspired a little bit by Gilder's book, was in response to some of these ideas whose trajectories you also saw.
Yes. And we want to live in a community where we live out our Christian faith and not just on Sundays. So in North America, it makes sense where if you're living in positive world, and you find a good church and everybody's doing decent, normal things, and you go to be encouraged in the word on the Lord's Day, you can think, oh, this is normal. But place First Memorial Church or whatever church it is in the middle of Sodom. Okay.
Yeah.
And now you go to church and you worship and you come out and, well, who's that mob on my front porch and what are they doing and how am I supposed to respond to this? So what we've wanted to do is sort of create a alternative economy, create a culture, create a community where we live with one another and interact with one another all the time. And we do it like Puritans, not like monks. So in the medieval world, there was the monks did a lot of good when they went off and built their monastery and they learned to do craft beer and they invented a bunch of things. But these monasteries had one flaw, and that is they had to be supplemented by volunteers. They had to recruit. What the Puritans did was they had sort of a monastic ideal only with marriage and sex. And when you have marriage and sex in your sold out for Jesus community, what happens is kids, You have
Mhm.
you have the challenge of the next generation, and then you have the challenge that presents itself to the people of God throughout the Old Testament of how do we transmit an understanding of faithfulness generationally. So
Mhm.
how do we hand the baton to the next generation, and how do we labor such that the next generation is not the generation that takes all these things for granted, but rather is the generation that grows up understanding what we passed on to them, and they stand on our shoulders. So the natural force of gravity means that the next generation is a little more slack.
Mhm.
What you want is the next generation to be in 8th grade where you were in 6th grade.
So this is kind of the embodied attempt to refute the good men make hard times, or strong men make hard times. Strong men make
Yeah,
good times make you. It's kind of a refutation of that. How do we prevent that
right,
gravitational pull from taking over?
right. And it's not so much a refutation of that, because that saying is very, very true.
Yes.
That's the gravitational pull that everybody has to deal with. Right.
Hmm.
So and you see it on the family level, mom and dad don't have a dime. They're poor as church mice during their college years. They make a nice living. By the time their kids are teenagers, everything's comfortable. Well,
Hmm.
that kid growing up with everything comfortable is being shaped by something different than what shaped his dad.
Yes.
And dad has to budget for that. Right.
Hmm.
And you want your sons to do hard things, you know, you want to provide for them and teach them, protect them, but not too much.
Hmm. Hmm. So to get practical for just a minute, because I know that you saw the documentary Future Men is coming out soon. I enjoyed that book of yours. What suggestions would you give to fathers today who are listening to this and they're grappling with this very question? They're struggling, and okay, they don't have time to start a Sherwood Forest of their own. How do they
Mhm.
begin to land these values down into their own kids today, because they feel that gravitational pull, which in many ways is stronger than ever?
um, yes, great, great question. There are artificial, but it has been done. So
Mm,
um, you would have, let me give you an illustration of the kind of ethos. And I'm not saying every aspect of this is godly, but it represents a biblical set of values, right?
mhm,
Um, in the First World War, um, you had, or even as late as the Second World War, you had the blue bloods of of our republic, the natural Republican small r Republican aristocracy, the
mhm,
New England blue bloods. They were as likely to fly into combat as anybody else.
mhm,
Okay, George H.W. Bush was shot
mhm,
down. George Gilder's father, he was a New England blue blood, was killed in action. In the First World War, what I started to say was you had all the, it was a uh, horrible mess on the front, and Tolkien's vision of Mordor came from
mhm,
the battlefields of World War One, and you had men in trenches charging machine gun fire. Okay, and
yeah.
what did the aristocrats do in that war? Well, the aristocrats were the officers and were not armed, and they had a little swagger stick, like a conductor's baton.
Mhm,
And the officer, the elite, the aristocracy, would put the swagger stick under his arm and lead the charge unarmed into machine gun fire. And that was the aristocratic ethos of authority, um, respect, honor in a society comes with responsibilities.
mhm,
Okay. Now, what you
yeah.
have in and the responsibility is you take the hit first. You're you're in front. You now if you're bringing up your kid in suburban, cushy, middle class America, your teenage son grew up in a gated community.
Mhm,
Where is he going to learn that? Okay, where is he going to learn that? Now, if if I'm a dad in that situation, I would like him during his summer. I'll just make something up. I would like him during his summers going through college to work on an Alaskan fishing boat. Okay.
I like that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do something hard. Do something hard. Don't just say, I'm going to have everything handed to me on a platter. You want to, work as a logger, work with your hands, do something that's physically demanding. Okay. In some up to a point, and it depends on how it's handled, and it depends on the coach. Athletics can also serve that role. There are certain things that a young man cannot learn without throwing up by the side of the field. Right.
Yeah.
Basically, there are certain lessons that your body says no, and the coach says yes. Are you going to do what you have to do? Right. Those are the sorts of lessons. Now, it's historically anachronistic, but the saying took root that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eden. So that's not possible time wise, right. But the saying, I think the saying is represents a truth that you have to teach your sons to take responsibility. You have to teach them to be tough when they don't feel like being tough, and it's really hard for them to learn how to be tough when they grow up cozy.
Yes. That's almost the hardest lesson to learn, because it's hard to enforce pain, the necessary pain of growth on young boys. I think we may have lost some amount of cultural will to do that, to say, like, I'm going to subject my son to righteous pain so that he can grow from it. That almost seems like an anathema idea to our safety culture, if nothing else.
Right. Correct.
So going back
then you've got the influence of, you also have the influence of feminism, which, like it or not, may have influenced mom, and mom wonders why you're being so tough on her sweet baby.
One of the ideas that this makes me think of is around men's initiation. And I find this, of course, it's in many pagan and tribal cultures. Did Christian cultures ever have their own form of an initiation? That's a question that I get all the time, and I don't have a good answer for it, but it sounds like one possible solution to this problem.
Yes. I think I can't put my finger on one initiatory rite. Okay. That this is something that Christian cultures have done, but I do know that Christian cultures have participated in this this kind of thing on the American frontier. The initiation was sort of going into the deep end of the pool. You're old enough to be a father. You've got a strong back, and there's 40 acres to be staked out, just to the west here, and so you were equipped. If you'd grown up hard, working hard on the homestead that your father had carved out, you were equipped to do the next thing. And so that would be not an artificial initiation. The artificial initiation would be when you have you grew up in a civilized society. And I think probably the closest thing we had to something like that would be becoming an Eagle Scout. Right? You've been taught all these things. You passed it, and it wasn't a low bar either. The way it's not like that is a true initiation would be something that comes to all the boys. You know, everybody has to do it. So you would have to collectively. And then, of course, the Boy Scouts went and flaked, and
So to return to Sherwood Forest, I think it makes sense to me now, understanding the way that you see the trajectory of these ideas, going back to when you read Gilder, why you founded Logos School and New St. Andrews, asking the question and answering it with your own labor. How do we pass these values down to the next generation such that, as you said, we're in 6th grade, but they grow up in 8th grade, so to speak.
Yeah. Right.
And so this vision, did it just kind of took shape over time, or did it, because I know a lot of people around the country really admire what you're, myself included, admire what you've accomplished in Moscow. And so when I heard you say you've been working at it for 40 years, that would be why. Did the vision arrive whole all at once, or did you begin assembling it in pieces?
I think the answer to that would have to be both. So we began draining the swamp. Metaphorically, we began draining the swamp in the 70s, and we had absolutely no idea how big the swamp was or how many gators were in it.
Whoa.
So basically, did we have the big picture when, I'll just put it another way, did we have the big picture when we undertook this? The answer is no. I knew that there was a big picture. I knew that I wanted to make a dent at that big picture level, but I could not have told you all the ins and outs of it at the time. That has unfolded over time. So we began Logos School simply as concerned parents. We had kids, and we knew that we weren't going to do the normal deal, having them educated by people who didn't fear God. We knew that we didn't want that, and we knew we wanted a Christian education, and we knew that we didn't want a truncated Christian education either. So that's why we went with classical. And so we got that box and we opened it up, and there was all these, it was like a scavenger hunt. There were all these clues to something, this goes here and this goes here and this goes here. And you follow the clues from the scavenger hunt, and pretty soon you're involved in all kinds of things, economics, higher education, family culture, legal issues, and that one thing led to another. So our involvement as parents led me to, it's a long story, but I unpacked, the first thing I unpacked was optimistic eschatology. And then after that,
question.
Okay, that was happened in the mid 80s. And then in the late 80s, I became a Calvinist, because if I wanted the Bible to apply to everything, if I wanted an in-your-face God, if you know what I mean.
Yes, I do.
I grew up Armenian, conservative, evangelical, Baptistic surroundings, and I had a real deep prejudice against Calvinism. But our commitment to, we want to start a school with Scripture at the center, and all things relate back to the Word of God, and we wanted God involved in everything. We wanted to teach every subject as parts of a coherent whole with Scriptures at the center. Well, that led inexorably to Calvinism and a Kuyperian understanding of Calvinism. And then, so I became a Calvinist, and then that led to covenant theology, where I became Presbyterian and Baptist in the early 90s. So one thing led to another, and it really was a scavenger hunt. And if you had told me in 1978, this is what you're going to be in 40 years, I would have said no. So in certain respects, I knew what I was doing. I knew how the scavenger hunt was supposed to work, and I knew how to follow the clues. I did not know where I was going to wind up.
That's incredible, because I've learned so much from you from all these topics, and to see and to now understand the way they kind of fit together. There's this phenomenon, people say, overnight success. There's no such thing as an overnight success. It's just someone who's been working really hard in the background for a long time until the batter rises kind of all at once. And it's fascinating to hear all the way I was going to ask you about postmillennialism and when you came to that, because I listened to your Evening of Eschatology with John Piper and a couple others. And I don't know if you want to comment on that discussion. It seems to have new relevance. YouTube served it to me in the algorithm. Some people are coming around to that today.
Yeah, that Evening of Eschatology really had feet. I hear about it. I hear about it regularly. It keeps coming back around. so when I was involved in, we started at Logos School in 81, and I was by that time pastor of a church, and I had read Charles Finney, who in the circles I'd grown up in was something of a hero, a second Great Awakening Charles Finney, and I read a book of his on revival and was kind of put off by it, really actually appalled by it. And so I just sort of shelved the idea of revival. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Reformation, that if that's revival, deal me out. And then as a result of various things I was reading, I came across, I'd grown up generically pre-mill, not ever dispensational, but sort of a historic pre-mill, kind of nebulous. But at some point, I probably for 2 or 3 years, I would guess, I jettisoned all eschatological anything. I would read my Bible, and I couldn't get I knew what the pre-mill system was generally, but I couldn't get it to fall out of the text, to come out of the text at me. Mm-hmm. So I shelved it. I said, okay, I'm not anything. And I was a pastor by this point. And I remember telling someone, look, Jesus is coming again, and don't push me. That's all I'm going to say. Jesus is coming again, and I can't tell you after that, I've got nothing. And so I was an agno-millennialist for 2 or 3 years. Okay. And I would read things in the Psalms, and I remember writing in the margin post-mill ? Not even being sure what that was. And I was reading also during this time because I wanted to understand how scriptures engaged with everything. The only people talking about that at the time were the Reconstructionists and the Gary North, Roussos Rushdoony, Greg Monson, those guys. And so I was reading a good deal of the Reconstructionists because of they were willing to apply scriptures to banking and apply scriptures to education and apply. So I was hungry for that. And I was reading one of these guys. It was David Chilton's book on eschatology. And his hermeneutic was a little bit too gaudy for me, a little too oogly boogly. And
it's a technical term.
Yes, technically, yes. But I was reading along, and he quoted 1 Corinthians 15, and this was probably 85 thereabouts. And he quoted this verse: "For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet." And when I read that verse, something snapped in my head. It was like a tsh. And it was like one of those transformer thingies assembling in my head. It was like all these verses that I knew and had sort of set aside or shelved, everything just sort of assembled in my head, because Christ is at the right hand of God the Father. He's going to remain there. For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. Well, once Jesus, and then the last enemy to be destroyed is death. Well, the way I'd been taught in premillennialism, when Christ comes back, the first enemy to be destroyed is death. But Paul says the last enemy to be destroyed is death. And he's going to destroy all the antecedent enemies from his throne in heaven, which is the essence of postmillennial thinking right there. So that's what happened in the mid-'80s. It was very exhilarating and, speaking honestly, a whole lot of fun. It was
it can be fun.
It can be fun. Now, becoming a Calvinist was no fun at all.
Okay, I want to hear about that.
So I don't want to act as though paradigm shifts are all about fun. Postmillennialism was fun because it was a shift from pessimillennialism. The world's going to hell. There's nothing you can do about it. God unfortunately got himself involved in a land war in Asia, and we're
Classic
looking
blunder.
a classic blunder, and we're going to be helicoptered out of Saigon any minute now, right? That
Yeah.
that's how evangelicals think. They're waiting for God's helicopters, and then they just bide their time and don't try to engage with anything. Well, that had that's all gone, and all of a sudden we're involved in a long-term battle that we are going to win, and that completely inverts your outlook on everything. Now we're
Mhm.
or I have come to believe that we are still today part of the early church, and
Mhm.
future school children will be studying for their church history test, and this semester was the early church, and they're going to be trying to remember, and they're going to try to remember who lived first. Was it Athanasius or C.S. Lewis? I
Mhm.
always get those guys confused, um, because they have to learn out of a book. Well, that being the case, we can have some pretty gnarly enemies, dragons to slay.
Mhm.
So when the Allies landed at Normandy on D-Day, it was ferocious fighting. But once the beachhead was established, the war was over.
Mhm.
And thinkers in the West knew that the war was over, knew that we were going to win it, and were making post-war plans. Uh,
Mm.
uh, and so, in fact, even C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength has a reference in it to Mrs. Dimble says to Mr. Dimble, Dr. Dimble, "Oh, it's almost as though we'd lost the war." But that book was written like in 43, um,
Mhm.
and published during the war. So there was we knew that the beachhead was established. So postmillennialism doesn't discount the fact that we have a lot of fierce dragons to slay. What we're saying is the beachhead is established, and it's in principle done.
I completely agree. I mean, it may not necessarily look that way, from a
Right.
casual observer standpoint, but certainly there's a feeling. There's a feeling there that feels something important, significant has been accomplished, despite Drag Queen Story Hour, despite
Right.
you know all of that. So
Right.
let's. I want to transition to talking about Christian nationalism and mere Christendom,
Okay.
because this seems to be the big one of the big hot topics of dragons to slay is the dragon of secularism as it shows up for the moment in the government sphere. So
Right.
let's start with the Wolfe book. The way that I see the Wolfe book, and I don't know that the Twitter dialogue sees it this way, is someone has finally put forth a positive vision for what a Christian nation can look like. Not
Right.
saying no, not that, no, not that. He put forth a solid brick positive vision and subjected to critique, which I think is an incredibly brave thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And Wolfe is operating. He has a real grasp and understanding of the political theory of the Protestant
Mhm.
reformers. And
Yeah.
basically what he's doing is he is laying out the political theory of the Protestant reformers in modern dress. And
Mhm.
there are places where I would take issue. He's a Thomist and I'm not a Thomist, and things like that. But he knows the Protestant reformers, he knows their political theory, and he knows how out of step with that political theory the modern heirs of the Reformation actually are. And that's
Hmm.
one of the reasons for the freak out responses.
So he's put his finger on something that he can actually see that they're out of step when perhaps in the past it was a little bit more hidden.
Yeah. So let's tie this in with um, at least as far as I'm concerned, I'm post mill. I don't think Wolf is, but
He's
I'm
a
post
mill, I think
mill.
he said.
Yeah. And uh, I grew up, I sort of came to a more mature understanding of my Reformed faith by reading a bunch of Banner of Truth books. So the
Mhm.
Banner of Truth guys did a valuable service by reprinting the Puritans, and they got a lot of the Puritan stuff back in print. And God bless them for that. It was just really, really
Mm.
good. But they didn't do that. They didn't do it with the Puritans' political theory. Um, right. So if you're a modern,
Seems significant.
if you're a modern Protestant Reformed type, and you have a steady diet of Puritans mediated to you through Banner of Truth, it's going to be pietistic and lopsided. Okay, because the Puritans were great devotional writers. Watson was. Rutherford, the letters of Samuel Rutherford, soared to devotional heights. But then if you read Lex Rex, also by Rutherford, you're going to think it was two different men. Well, he is an advocate of Protestant resistance theory, and he goes deep dive and so if your only experience of Rutherford is the loveliness of Christ or the letters of Samuel Rutherford, it's going to be cockeyed. You're not going to understand how earthy and engaged with their nations the Puritans were. Okay, now and you could make the opposite mistake also. You could be a political junkie and just read the Puritans on politics. But what the Puritans were they were full-orbed Christians. They were Christians when they wrote literature. They were Christians when they made beer. They were Christians when they built towns and developed civic mechanisms for governing themselves. They were Christians first and foremost everywhere. And that's simply what Christian nationalism is. Can I be a Christian while I'm articulating my political theory? Is it relevant at all?
Yeah, does all things under his feet mean all things, or all things, does that not include the government somehow? Like, what do we mean when we say all? This is why the Christian nationalist conclusion, whichever positive picture you paint, because someone else could write a book that paints a different picture of Christian nationalism, and I encourage them to write that 500-page book and to get started soon. They could put forth a different picture, but certainly Wolfe has done, when I was reading it, a remarkable job of saying, this is how it could work based on my understanding of these things. Yeah. And no one's really put forth another positive vision of that, which I find to be odd.
Right. And the reactions to him has been largely a matter of misunderstanding or misconstruing or calling names, saying he's a racist or, whatever.
Yeah, that was actually something that I noticed with the Gilder book as well. Having read both these books myself, and to see these little tiny slivers of almost nothing that have been blown up to these gargantuan proportions to slander an entire intellectual work, it's been a little shocking to see that for myself.
Yeah.
Shocking. Having read it.
Yeah, shocking is a good word. Shocking is a good word for it.
Yeah, it seems unfair, at least in the case of the Gilder book, but we can talk about that separately, because that was just such an incredibly based book. So, so the positive vision of Christian nationalism that Wolfe puts forward, where do you see that locating in sort of the post-millennial vision, the Sherwood Forest kind of vision? Is it meant to be a rallying flag that everyone can get behind? Is it meant to be something like, read this and let it stimulate your own thought? How does it fit into the bookshelf or into the pantheon? I guess maybe not pantheon.
So I would say that one of the things that gives me hope is looking at the disarray of clown world. In the long run, stupidity never works, and at some point, people are going to be brought up short with the reality of stupidity doesn't work. When 3 or 4 or 5 blue states go bankrupt, like Margaret Thatcher once said, the problem with socialism is that sooner or later you run out of other people's money, and then all the bills come due, and people and you hit the wall, and someone's going to say, someone made a joke about the mess in Israel. I saw a joke on Twitter where someone said, I just saw an army recruiting ad that featured a white heterosexual male. I guess we are going to war.
Saw that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in other words, if your recruiting ads are featuring black woke lesbians to get people to
Mhm.
join the army, the lesson that I would draw from that is that this is a country that is currently facing no threats whatever. Okay. At some point, it it gets serious. At some point, you don't have the luxury of all the social engineering experimentation. So,
Mhm.
um, I was in the Navy and served in the submarine service, and since I got out, some genius decided to start putting women on submarines, which
Yeah.
is about the dumbest idea ever, and
Yeah.
and second only to putting women on surface ships. Yeah, it's just ugh. But the only
Mhm.
reason that works is that we're not at war. Um,
Right.
it's right. As soon as an existential threat arises, all of a sudden these um, um, what Nietzsche experiments are going to be far too costly. And so what I see happening is the collapse of the secular ideal, and in certain sectors, well, this has happened at least a couple times in history. When Constantine made made Christianity legal, and then Theodosius made it the religion of the empire. The reason the reason Constantine did that, and I'm not questioning whether he was sincere in his Christian faith or not, but there were political pressures on him to do
Mhm.
this, and the political pressure was that Rome was falling apart. Okay, and as an emperor of this big shambling giant, um, he looked at the Christian church, which had which was a universal small c Catholic church, bishops from all over the world meeting in concert to discuss things. They had something that Rome did not have, and
Mhm.
what happened was Rome essentially gave up and handed the keys to the Christians. Now, and I think the same thing happened in the Puritan Revolution in England, where the Puritans took over for a while because the previous regime just sort of ran out of gas. They just um, couldn't do it. I think we're headed for a similar moment. I believe
Mm.
that because it's a global thing, there will be parts of the globe that where the secularists don't run out of gas. They can keep going for a while, but there will be places where they say we give up, um, and Christians are going to be in a position if they've thought through these things, if they've read up on it, if they've read
Mhm.
Wolfe, and if they've read my Mere Christendom book, and
Mhm.
they're engaged with these things, they're going to be perhaps more ready for prime time than we've been in some of the previous eras when we 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 found ourselves running the show before we were quite ready.
Mhm. So this leads to mere Christendom, which I took as sort of a rallying cry for a reinvigorated Christian spirit against the sort of secularist pagan energy of our age. Like, how can we reinvigorate the masculine Christian spirit active to get out into the world and to take dominion?
Yes, very much
Hmm.
so.
And
And it begins with recognizing that secularism is bankrupt. They
mhm.
they Secularism cannot give an account of itself.
Why do you think there are so many Christians that are still holding on to this notion of what seems to be a secular, a neutral space? I saw your response video to Owen Strachan, and I found it striking that he would suggest that there's still some neutral space out there. Are we not clear
Yeah.
that that doesn't exist?
Yeah. Yeah. So when Owen says things like "I believe in democracy," and then a few days later, a Democratic referendum in Ohio puts
Correct.
abortion into the Constitution of Ohio. So is that
Hmm.
I don't believe in democracy. I believe in righteousness. Democracy is a
Hmm.
mechanism. A republic is a mechanism. A monarchy, a constitutional monarchy is a mechanism. the standards of righteousness are not to be found in any mechanism. You can have a tyrannical king, you can have a just king, you can have a just society voting in just laws, or a rogue society voting in an unjust law. So the idea that now going back to your question, the reason I think Christians are still somewhat enamored of secularism is that in this pretended neutral world, there's a pretend. The secularists have told us, well, there's a realm of neutrality, and Christians said, oh, okay. And then we go into the realm of neutrality, and when Christians operate in the realm of neutrality, because they're Christians, they obey the rules. Okay, they say, okay, we agreed to be neutral, so we'll keep Christianity out of it.
I get it.
We'll run on this. We'll be in the school board, and we'll be involved in the PTA and all of this stuff, and we'll keep our Christianity out of it. And the secularists agreed to keep their paganism out of it, but they break their word. Okay, so we've been showing up at the soup kitchen, right? And we keep bringing our ingredients, and they bring their ingredients, and we agree it's all neutral, right? But they've been lacing the food with cocaine, and they've been doing it for decades, and they cheat, right? Well, the Christians don't cheat. The Christians said, well, if you let Christians have a secular space, Christians could run a secular space, and we'd keep it decent. Yeah, because that would be because you're just doing all your Christianity stuff off budget. You're still doing it, right? And so that's why I think Christians think that secularism could work, because if people like Owen ran the quote unquote secularism, the pretense could be kept up for a while. But it's not people like Owen. It's not people like Owen. It's people who hate God.
It's a little bit like Lucy and Linus with the football, right? You got the Linus going to kick it, and Lucy just pulls it away every time. Like, it's like, no, there never was any neutrality. Well, maybe there was for a time. Hard to say, but certainly now there's not.
I would only differ with you by saying it's not a little like Lucy and the football. It's exactly like Lucy and the football.
Yeah, exactly. So what do you think it will take, or what would you like for it to take for Christians to recognize that this is what's going on, and for Christians to begin showing up in force in all the ways of their life that are meaningful? It may not necessarily be political engagement in terms of the civil magistrate. It may be in their workplace. It may be in their families. It may be in their communities. It doesn't necessarily have to be everyone's single focused effort towards one specific aim. Yeah. What sort of things would be necessary to invigorate Christian men and women and families to begin that dominion-taking process throughout the country in the ways that they feel called?
Yeah, everything begins at home. It begins in the area. I'm not required to begin by changing or fixing the things I can't reach. I need to begin where I can reach. I need to get my family to worship God on a weekly basis. I have to bring up my children to the nurture and admonition of the Lord. I have to gather together with like-minded Christians where I live, and I need to have loyalty to the larger project. And if you're a Christian leader, a pastor, a blogger, some sort of one of those guys, the way to start, the place to start, is by avoiding and resisting the temptation to give way to turf wars. Okay? So the last thing in the world we need is for secularism to start falling apart, and for the Christians to start fighting each other.
Yeah.
Okay? So I used to, years ago, and I think that's probably the gravest temptation I think we are facing right now, is strife between Christians.
Yeah.
In the day when secularism is disintegrating. Years ago, I said I defined an evangelical in North America, and this is a very broad definition, but an evangelical in North America is someone who likes Billy Graham. And a
Sure.
reformed Christian in North America was someone who liked R.C. Sproul. And
Okay.
and I wondered at the time what was going to happen when both those men went to be with the Lord. When there's no longer that rallying point or that point of identification. And I'm afraid that too many Christian leaders in the evangelical world and then also in the Reformed world lined up to be the replacement.
Oh,
You know,
interesting.
okay, who's gonna carry the mantle? Who's gonna take the man? Who's going to be the Elisha to that Elijah? And
Mm-hmm.
and then when it turned out that more than one person thought of himself that way, strife began between them. And so I think
Mm-hmm.
Christian leaders ought to remember what the Lord Jesus did with the disciples when a dispute arose among them as to who was going to be the greatest. Don't think like that. Don't think like that. Don't think like that.
Right. That's I'm so glad that you said that, because I think the challenges that we face as Christians and also as men mean that different men will be called forth to lead in different ways. And there is not
Mm-hmm.
one central single figure outside
Yeah,
of Christ. But here on earth right now, we all are called in different ways to lead, and no one has to be called the greatest to lead.
right.
That's
And
the big part. Go ahead.
there's no one correct way of doing it. There's the army does not need ships, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But so my dad wrote a book called Principles of War, applying military principles of war to spiritual warfare. And one of them was cooperate. One of the principles is cooperation, and
Mm-hmm.
it's great for West Point and Annapolis to have the annual Army Navy game. It's great to have that kind of competitiveness on the football field. But when a war starts, you don't want that competitiveness to carry over. You want the Navy and the Army to be coordinated and thinking of themselves as on the same side.
Mm-hmm. So, one of the things that I've observed is sometimes in Christian communities around theological distinctives and things like that, there can be a sort of intolerance for ambiguity that both people have to work for. Exactly like you said, we both have to be able to make forward progress, knowing that we disagree on things like infant baptism, for
Right.
example. And there seems to be this need, like, no, we have to decide who's right. It's like, not necessarily right now.
Yeah. Well, yeah,
So, what advice? Go ahead.
let's join together. Baptists and Presbyterians join together to get the bad guys to stop killing the babies. And then after we've saved the babies' lives, then we can discuss whether or not they should be baptized.
Mhm. It almost seems like a bit of like missing the point of wanting to, sort of pop out into a spiritual discussion instead of have an on the ground practical discussion of getting our hands dirty.
Right, exactly.
So I also caught the discussion that you had last night, Andrew Isker and Joe Rigney about your upcoming book. Now, this was of
Yeah.
particular interest to me because I actually grew up Jewish. So
Oh,
so
yeah.
I watched that with great interest, and so I wonder if you could talk about your upcoming book. I was really pleased to hear that there were a lot of things that you seem to understand about the upbringing that I came up through and the community that I passed through. Much longer discussion, but talk a bit about your upcoming book as well.
Yeah, the book is released now. It's called
Mm.
American Milk and Honey, and the subtitle is, let's see if I remember, the promises of Deuteronomy and the true Israel, anti-Semitism, the promises of Deuteronomy, and the true Israel of God. So
Lightweight
basically,
topic.
yeah, and so consequently, in the book, I'm all over the road. I'm addressing all kinds of different things, like what is supersessionism? Well, for
Hmm.
Christians, that is the view that the church is Israel now. Okay,
Hmm.
the heir of all the promises of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament are the present possession of the Christian church. Now, there's hard supersessionism, which says, and that means the Jews are nothing special anymore. They're just
Hmm.
another ethnic group. And then there's what I call soft supersessionism, which is the historic Reformed view, which is that at a certain point, Israel is going to come back to the Messiah. They're going to trust in Christ, and that's going to be the key to world evangelization.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
It's Romans 11, right?
Romans 11. So the Romans 11 argument, and then in the modern Reformed era, there's a preterist take on Romans 11, which Andrew Isker was representing in our discussion. But I'm following the classic Reformed view of Romans 11, which is that the evangelization of ethnic Israel is going to be the key to world evangelization. But then there are the geopolitical issues. What do you think of Israel as a nation state and the founding of Israel in 1948? Then there are the what is Judaism exactly? Is there such a thing as the Judeo-Christian tradition? What is that? And I have a chapter on the Talmud, 2 chapters on the Talmud, actually. One of them looks at all the horrendous things that are in there, and there's some pretty bad things in there. And then I also have a chapter looking at some of the glorious things that are in the Talmud that rabbis over the centuries have seen and exegeted, and they're treasures that Christians can benefit from. So there's that, and then probably the centerpiece of the book is what I regard as the Pauline strategy for winning the Jews. So, and this is under the anti-Semitism point, the Hamas attack on Israel, and then Israel reacting, and then the leftist protests in London and New York and DC, where they're just unabashedly embracing Hamas, is flabbergasting to what on earth is going on. And then some on the right, there's an alt-right black-pilled contingent of anti-Semitism that sort of joined in. And I'm trying to, so in the book, I address that. Where's this coming from? And when I talk to someone who's anti-Semitic, usually online, where someone says, the Jews are doing all these awful things. The Jews are running the pornography industry, and the Jews are in positions of influence in all the George Soros globalism world, in the banking world, and all, they've done all these awful things. And my response to that is, look, the Jews, for all sorts of historical reasons, are a high performance people. They are less than 1% of the world's population. And if you look at their patents, at their Nobel Prizes, at the, musical accomplishments, it's a disproportionate impact for positive things. And when you have Jews from that culture who go over the dark side, they're going to have a disproportionate impact over there too. So when Andrew said several times in our discussion that a lot of the people he deals with are just tired of not being allowed to point certain obvious truths out, like a bunch of the Bolsheviks were Jews. That's historically true. Yep. And so I'd say yes. So why can't I point out the disproportionate number of brain surgeons among the Jews? Why can't I point out the disproportionate number of Nobel Prize winners? Well, now all of a sudden you're using facts as a cudgel instead of facts as something you want to take. You want all of the facts on board, and then sort them out and say what's the truth here. And I think so. So this leads up to the Pauline strategy, the high performance nature of the Jews is a performance sort of thing. It's a law thing. It's a Jewish mother thing. So you will take violin lessons, and you will be good, and in fact, you will be the best in show. And so there's a centuries long ethos of that kind of thing. And Paul in Romans says that God pours out his grace and his blessing on Gentiles as a way of provoking his people to jealousy. All right.
Mhm.
And Paul knew his people, his kinsmen according to the flesh. He knew that this was a people upon whom that strategy would work. All right. Um,
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
where on earth? So if you have this Gentile Christian nation prospering under the blessings of Deuteronomy, how are the Jews going to react to that? And the type that I set up in the book is the wonderful parable that is provided by that great movie Chariots of Fire.
Mhm.
Because in Chariots of Fire, you have a Christian runner, and Eric Liddell, and a Jewish runner, Howard Abrams, and they're both Olympians. They both are excellent. They both are wonderful runners, and one is under grace and the other's under law. Um, Abrams is just driven, um, just simply driven, and Liddell says, "When I run, I feel His pleasure." It is sort of like God's grace is on him. And so what I want, and I think what the Apostle Paul would want, is for Christians to stop being semi-Gnostic, to stop thinking that our salvation is an airy-fairy kind of thing, and to start living under God's earthy blessings, and at the center of which are the spiritual blessings of salvation and forgiveness and new covenant and everything. But the blessings of Deuteronomy have to come in. So that's what this book is about. You asked for the time, and I'm giving you the history of watchmaking. But
That's right. Well, I'm glad that you gave me that metaphor because I grew up Jewish, bar mitzvah, birthright Israel. That's a whole. So I ran under law for a very long time, and you were
right,
absolutely right about it being a high performance culture. Like you will
right,
do well. Period. This is not a
right,
negotiation.
right.
And that comes with a very high cost. And I
Yeah,
was very blessed to learn what it is now to run under grace. And you've been one of my finest teachers in that regard. So to hear you reflect that and your understanding of the Jewish people, and then also to read Romans for myself and to read that and to understand Paul's story reflected in my own was a very moving moment for me in my faith journey. So I
that's great.
appreciate you tackling these topics.
Well, I think that you will enjoy the book. I hope so.
I have a sneaky suspicion that's the case. Yes. Um, do you have time for just one more personal question,
Yeah,
some
yeah,
quasi personal question? Okay. So
sure.
recently, this is kind of to go back to the Calvinist. I listened to your book, Easy Chairs and Hard Words, and at the end of that book, which was marvelous. At the end of that book, there's the pastor that the question that the parishioners coming to ask questions of relates the story of a man who understood the Christian faith better than the
Oh, yeah,
evangelist did.
yeah.
Was that a real story? Did that really happen, or was that a made up scenario? That felt like
That
it might be real somehow.
yeah that was I would say it was a fictional story, but it was the
Hmm.
kind of thing where um, had there were places in my life where had that happened to me, I would have been stupefied. I would have been wiped out,
Hmm.
just like the pastor was. In other words, it was fictional, but close to home.
Hmm. And so, for a man who might be in that position now of beginning to examine all of these different issues, postmillennialism, dominion taking, Christian nationalism, et cetera, everything that we've covered, even Calvinism versus Arminianism, where would you recommend a man like that begin? Because one thing I know for sure is that Jared Longshore's little book, The Case for the Christian Family, is having a massive influence throughout my circles. It's driving many people to begin asking sincere questions about paedobaptism, begin moving in that direction. As an example, where would you invite men to begin? Because I think a lot of people, these questions are up. How do we reformulate our own worldviews to begin building for now and for the future? Even though we're in the early church, how can those men, where can they start to begin building?
So I would say it would depend on where they are. So, for example,
Hmm.
if they're teens, I would start them on Future Men. If they're
Hmm.
young single college, probably the same, probably Future Men. If they're
Hmm.
young married, if they're been married for less than 2 years, I would start them on reforming marriage. If they're,
Hmm.
it would say, okay, this would go back to what I said earlier. Start where you are, you know, um,
Hmm.
and say, okay, how can I bring Reformation and Dominion thinking to where I am in this moment. Okay. So if I'm single and I want to get married, how do I do that in a way that honors God? If I'm single and I don't want to inflict myself on a girl yet, but I want to get things squared away so that I could. What do I do to get things squared away? If I've got 3 kids already, what do I do with that? So a lot of it all depends. I would say the range of for most men, I would say the suite of family books that we have, and things that obliquely relate. I've got a small book, Why Christian Ministers Must Be Men, Federal Husband, things like that. Basically, the masculinity works would be the place for most to start.
And if you were a young man who was getting to a place where he was beginning to lead a woman who's asking these questions for herself, and maybe he's a couple steps ahead and they're not yet anything yet, what book might you recommend for that man?
You know a guy?
Hypothetically. I might. Asking for a friend.
Yeah. So what I would do is I would go look for the counterpart. So so we have a bunch of books for women. My daughter's book, Eve in Exile. My other daughter's book, Loving the Little Years, and Yoo-Hoo. And then on domestic stuff, my wife's book, The Fruit of Her Hands, and Praise Her in the Gates. And so basically, if you're interested in a girl, a guy should say, is this description of Christian marriage attractive to you, or does it repel you? And there's generally three possible responses. One is, it totally attracts me. This is, tell me more. The other is, it repels me. Which is a feminist identifier. And then there's the middle area where I'm really attracted to it, but I don't think it's real. Okay. This seems too much like a fairy tale, like I'm dancing with the prince in the Cinderella movie. Wouldn't it be nice? But I've never met anybody who lives like this. Right. And that person is a person who's not a feminist. They've just been burned. Does that make sense? All right. So, okay. So they're the ideological feminists. They're the committed Christians. This is wonderful. Teach me more how to do it. And then the people who are attracted to it because they're made in the image of God, and this resonates with their nature, but not with their experience. And so they're going to want it, before they go out on that frozen lake, they're going to want to throw a brick or two on it to see if it will hold them.
And what would you say to those women that are in that position? Like, yeah, that sounds amazing. I've never seen that before.
Right. I'd say the guys, I would tell the women, guys are in the same position.
Say more about that.
Okay.
I get it. Yeah.
So right now, I would say that I'm going to go up the stairs 3 at a time here, but I've heard a lot of lamenting in Christian circles. Why don't Christian men get off their butt and go get married? Where are all the good men? And it's sort of Father's Day, but here's the thing: in Christian churches on Father's Day, you can routinely go and find somewhere where they're going to kick the men around the sanctuary for time to step up, time to man up. What a bozo you're being, and then just try to imagine the reverse scenario on Mother's Day. Right. So where the women are told, go to church on Mother's Day, and when was the last time you cooked a pie? So we live in a culture that is hostile to men.
Yes.
Okay. It's hostile to men, hostile to masculinity. And this shows up in who initiates divorce. 70% of divorces are initiated by by the women. In that ballpark. I'm not sure the exact
Mhm.
number, but a lot. And
A lot.
we live in a culture where a man can have his life ruined if he's accused of some sexual impropriety, whether he did anything or not. He can.
Mhm.
So a lot. What has happened is a lot of men have gone on strike. Right.
Mhm.
Um, they've just said, "Deal me out." I don't need all this drama. And and I and then this is an era where that has made pornography free and ubiquitous, free love, and why buy the cow when you can get the milk through the fence? What's the
Mhm.
um, you've got
Yeah.
all these inducements, some negative, some positive, not positive according to God's law, but some
Sure.
bribes, some threats, and so when a man, and this is where Gilder is so helpful, when a man
Mhm.
gives up his independence, and I'm going to speak in crass transactional terms, when a man
Mhm.
gives up his independence and promises to be with one woman for the rest of his life, what does he get in return? In modern America, virtually nothing.
Yes.
Right? If his
Very
wife
little.
gets if his wife gets pregnant, she can make a decision to abort the child. She and her doctor can make the decision to abort the child. And he, even though he's the lawful father and in covenant with her, has no say in the matter. I mean, absolutely no say. So, um, in that ethos, you have not just the abortion of the child, but the abortion of the family. So,
Mhm.
What Gilder says is that if you want men to stick around, you have to have their constructive contributions honored and accepted and set apart. The men
Mhm.
have to be invited to be men in the household, and and until that happens, you're going to continue to have men deliberately dragging their feet on marriage. So when I got
Mhm.
married, it was just a generation ago. When I got married when I was 22, and I was right in the middle of the pack. That's when it almost always happened. You
Mhm.
got married, you graduated from college, and you got married. You dated a girl your senior year, and okay, now I got a job and I can start off. The average age of marriage now is like 28 or 29, and
Yeah.
that has really bad effects culturally and societally, and people don't understand that that is not the result of men screwing off. That's the result of the unremitting hostility that our society has toward constructive young men who want to lead and shape their homes.
Mhm. Could not agree more. Could not agree more. Women creating space, stepping back from occupying that space in a competitive sense, just stepping back and allowing the young men to step forward is key to so much of this. And yet, that is the most forbidden idea to even express, that women should step back at all to invite men to step forward into the space that they had previously been occupying.
Exactly right.
Well, thank you so much for your generosity of your time today. Thank you so much for the work that you do, and I'm looking forward to more exciting fireworks and flamethrowers during No Quarter
Yes, very good.
November. Where would you like to send men, real quick? If you could send them anywhere at the end of this, where would you like to send them to find out more?
Sure, but probably the best thing to do is if they go to my blog on Mablog, and the address is dougwills.com. We've arranged it so on the front page of my blog, there's a portal to pretty much everything I'm involved in.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Pastor Wilson. I greatly appreciate this time to talk with you today.
Oh, you're very welcome.